on, Doctor.
Thanks, Larry. Appreciate it. And good morning to everyone. We're excited to be here and be able to share with you some of the work that we've been doing over the last few months. But before we get started, I just want to take a moment and thank Robin at Flagler, Volusia, Marcy at Bavard, and Brian at the Research Coast just for their leadership. We have the opportunity of working with workforce systems across the country, and it is truly a pleasure to be around individuals as passionate as they are. Next. So as Larry mentioned, my name is Christopher Laney. I've had the great privilege of working for Lightcast for the last few years. And before I got here, I was part of the Florida workforce system, now living in Northern Idaho. And so it is truly good, even virtually, to be joining you. And I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Ashley Peterson, to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. Can we see my slides? Great. I'm Ashley Peterson. I'm senior consultant here on Lightcast's community consulting team. So I'm working with economic development and workforce development groups all over the country to really help them leverage our data to uncover insights about their workforce. I had the pleasure to be kind of the day-to-day project manager on this specific project, and I'm excited to kind of share some highlights of our work and recommendations coming out of that work with you today.
Great. So I want to take just a moment. There are some of you on this call that might not know who Lightcast is. So before we jump into our insights and the work that we've done, I just wanted to share a little bit about us. So again, our mission is to unlock the new possibilities in the labor market by informing communities, education, and employers. We work with all those entities. I'll show you that in just a second. We've been doing this for about 20 years. Some of you might know us by our original names, MZ and or Burning Glass. We merged a couple of years ago, became MZ Burning Glass, now Lightcast for the past year. As of today, we do produce the most comprehensive, up-to-date picture on the labor market, both real-time and traditional labor market analytics. And we are a team of about 750 employees, as Larry alluded to earlier. We are headquartered one spot in Moscow, Idaho, as well as Boston, UK, and India. And then we have team members like Ashley spread out across the entire country, working remote. And so it is a pleasure to be here. Next. We have the pleasure of working with some of the biggest names and brands around the world. You can see here from government, like the Department of Labor and the Department of Defense, foundations like Markle and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to many of the brands that we work with each and every day, using our data and analytics and analysis for a variety of purposes. Anything from site selection to how to hire better based on skills, using either our data or our APIs to be able to make really good and informed decisions. Next. And through this work, we have had the opportunity to produce studies. If you do not follow us on LinkedIn, we produce studies probably about monthly or every 2 months. And these are studies that you can download and learn what's happening in the labor market, from talent attraction to aligning to skills. More prominently, over the last couple of years, we've been talking a lot about demographic drought and what we're seeing around the labor force participation. And this next slide, and this has led to our economists and our teams being featured in some of the biggest names in the media on a weekly basis. I just read yesterday, we were in the Wall Street Journal this week a couple of times talking about a variety of areas in the labor market. Next. Now, it's nice to talk about it nationally, but here in the state of Florida, we have the great privilege of working with many organizations and brands here in the state of Florida, from the state level all the way down to our economic development partners, to businesses, colleges, universities. Even some of you on this call here probably have used some of our data or some of our insights in some of the work that we've done. Next. And this has also led to studies that are specific to Florida, not even talking about the study that we're going to talk about today, but we have also been working with other partners in the state, anything from looking at credentials to a skills alignment, to economic impact analysis, asset mapping. We just finished a study earlier this year with the Able Trust Foundations on what it will take to help labor force participation among individuals with disabilities. And so we have really had a pleasure to work with individuals in Florida for a while. Next. So before we get started on the insights, we do want to just touch a little bit on what we're seeing nationally and at the state level, so that you have some context as we get into the data that we saw just in the region. So a couple of points that I want to just elaborate on for just a second. One, I mentioned labor force participation around what we call the demographic drought. For many, many years, and still to this day, a lot of times we look at a region's success in the workforce based on unemployment. If the unemployment rate is low, then they must be doing well. However, what we saw right before the pandemic and throughout the pandemic is we had a lot of individuals that weren't collecting unemployment, but were still on the sidelines. We're still not working. And that's where we really started to bring up the importance of labor force participation. Those that should be working, but for whatever reason, they're not working. We still expect to see labor force participation decline over the next 5 years. And so even as individuals are becoming working age, there's a lot of individuals choosing not to work. America is aging at rapid paces. We, for the first time in United States history, by 2034, children will outnumber older adults. The U.S. age dependency rate will grow from 46% to 60% by 2030. United States has always benefited from having kind of a younger workforce, where we have seen these trends in Europe for many years. And so this is going to put a huge emphasis on what are we going to do to be able to replace those workers, and or if we can't replace these workers, how do we operate in an economy where we don't have enough people to do the jobs? The labor pool of our lower skilled individuals is drying up at significant rates, whether it's age or just the fact that individuals that either have a high school diploma or less are just not available to work. These are many of those sub $20 an hour jobs. And you think about some of the jobs that maybe you're trying to fill in areas like hospitality or retail, where these are a lot of those first jobs that individuals get, either 16 or 20 years old. And those individuals are just not available to work. America predominantly has won the war on talent globally, and I'm speaking specifically to immigration. However, as this talent shortage is crossing international borders, other countries are now developing strategies to keep their talent at home. We have a variety of data. I recommend, we put out a study end of last year, called the Global Demographic Drought, where we started to bring up the importance of what this is going to look like, what it will take to be able to compete on the national stage for talent. Next slide. In Florida, there are some similar trends. Now, Florida, when it comes to labor force participation, has recovered from some of the pre-pandemic percentages, but it is still at all-time lows, and we are expecting to continue to see some of those declines. We just saw a 0.5% decline earlier this year, which is a big deal when we look at trying to get individuals into work. Florida right now has over 7.5 million individuals working over the age of 55, and is below the national average for the amount of millennials that work right now in the state of Florida. This is a big deal, as those individuals are starting to retire or will continue to retire. Who's going to replace those workers? So Florida's cost of living, that is something that continuously comes up. We hear about cost of living quite often right now, especially with the rise of inflation. It has stayed in pace with many of the competitive states throughout the country. However, wages have not improved at the same rate as other states in the country. So while cost of living has increased with the other states, our wages haven't quite reached that same level. Florida has large populations in both legal immigration as well as undocumented workers. It also provides some pros and cons in the state and requires strategy on how to engage this potential workforce. There's a variety of things I'm not going to get into today, but we do have research around the importance of what immigration and even some of the undocumented workers that are coming into the state, what does that mean on the local economies? Next slide. I just want to take a moment, and just from a comparison standpoint, this is showing some comparisons to some of those larger states that we often look at. You can see here that when we look at the next 5 years, 4 to 5 years, our population is still projected to grow. New York, where I know a lot of us go, oh, everybody from New York must be moving down to Florida. their projected population is also supposed to grow at the same rapid pace as us. Texas is expected to grow a little bit faster than us, where Illinois is flat and California is at a negative percentage point. Now, when you look at this, when we look at the projected population and we start to dive into average earnings, this is one of the things I was talking about. So our cost of living in Florida is on pace for places like Illinois. It is obviously lower than, a little bit lower than New York and California, but our wages is also among the lowest among these comparable states. One of the benefits here is you can see our unemployment rate is almost half of the other states, meaning that individuals that are working in the state that are looking for jobs tend to find those jobs. Next slide. Now, in comparison to the region that we're talking about today, again, the 6 counties, Flagler, Volusia, Brevard, Martin County, Indian River, and Port St. Lucie, I compared that to other large metros in the state of Florida. You can see here that the Florida Atlantic Alliance benefits from the fact that you're expected to have 7% population growth over the next 4 years. The only other region that is experiencing that type of growth is Jacksonville. While the rest of Florida pretty much is experiencing a lot of net migration and people moving into the state, the only major region that is experiencing or will experience negative population growth is the Miami area. When you look at the cost of living index among these counties, the Florida Atlantic Alliance is on par with the rest of everyone else. So it's not cheaper to necessarily live in your area. It's pretty much on pace with the others that are surrounding your region, like Orlando, or if you go across the state to Hillsborough or go north to Jacksonville. However, again, when we look at wages, that cost of living average earnings is much lower than those surrounding regions. So it's something for employers to have to consider. If you're going to compete either within the state or on the national stage, you're going to have to raise wages. And unemployment is a bit higher than the other regions, but it's pretty much on pace with the rest. One of the areas that we, like I mentioned, that we look at pretty often is labor force participation. You are far below where you need to be able to compete in the state when it comes to labor force participation. Now, again, this does not mean that it's because you have tons of retirees. Once they hit the age of 65, they're not going to be calculated in that labor force participation percentage. And so we are looking at working age individuals that should be working, and for whatever reason, they are not working. And you can see here that Jacksonville is almost 8 percentage points higher, and then you're looking at about 15% percentage points lower than Hillsborough and in Orlando. And so this is pretty significant, and it gives us an opportunity to figure out ways to engage this workforce into the opportunities in the region. Next slide.
All right, thanks, Chris. That was super helpful context at the kind of the national and the state level to set the stage for the project that we did at the regional level. So I'll talk a little bit through some of our key findings from this project. Overall, the project objectives were to really understand the current labor market dynamics in the region, and specifically related to the target sectors of advanced manufacturing, aerospace, and cybersecurity. As Larry talked about, kind of those industry sectors, identify their key workforce needs and their challenges and opportunities to grow these sectors within the region. Just a little bit of background about the project deliverables. So this project was kind of multifaceted at the regional level. For all 6 counties combined, we provided a regional labor market assessment and sector analysis. And then for each of the 3 career source groups, they got a tailored skills analysis and sector analysis to really understand how some of these regional dynamics are playing out at a more local level. And then finally, an executive summary with key findings and recommendations. And that's really the piece that we're going to focus on today. So again, we conducted a full labor market assessment on the region, and from that we found these to kind of be the key strengths and challenges. We'll share some data on each of them here, but you'll see they're very much in alignment with some of the national and state trends that Chris talked about. So you can see here the region is home to just over 2 million people and has grown significantly in the past 5 years. That growth is projected to continue at an even faster pace than the US and the state. And by 2027, the region is projected to have over 2.1 million people And this is not necessarily the kind of fast population growth that we see everywhere in the country, so that really is a competitive advantage for the region. We also see that the demographic makeup of the region is changing. While white is currently the largest demographic group, and diversity in the region is still lower than the Florida average, the relative share of Hispanic and Black and African American populations in the region has grown between 2017 and 2022, and we expect that growth will continue. And then we also see, compared to state and national averages, the region has a higher than average educational attainment for high school diploma, some college and associate degree levels. And this is especially beneficial for employers within aerospace and advanced manufacturing, because as you'll see later in the presentation, a number of those occupations within those sectors require less than a bachelor's degree and are still, great, good paying jobs. Kind of on the inverse of this can also be a challenge, because that means the region's population has lower than average attainment for bachelor's degree, graduate degree, and higher. So that's kind of a double-edged sword there. On the flip side of kind of those strengths, some of the key challenges that we see, again, are in line with the national challenges that Chris highlighted, and in some cases even exacerbated at the local level. So the region has a low unemployment rate. Between January 2020 and December 2022, the region saw a trend in its unemployment rate similar to that of the state in the US. You can see the trend line kind of follows there. And it's, has eventually recovered to pre-pandemic levels in early 2022, but now the unemployment rate is very, very low, signaling a tight labor market. And then when we look at these two data points together, along with the low labor force participation rate, you can see that that's just another contributing factor to kind of the tight labor market that I'm sure you all are feeling there. You can see again that the trend kind of follows the state and the US, but the region's labor force participation rate is quite a few percentage points lower than the state and the US. The region also sees an aging population. Again, another trend that we see nationally, but even more of a challenge in the region, where about 27% of the regional population is 65 or older, compared to 22% at the state level and 17% of the US population. And this will be a continued challenge as more of these individuals continue to retire and not necessarily enough inflow of talent to replace people in the workforce. And then another challenge that we saw here was a net outflow of commuters in the region. So while we see that nearly 165,000 people commute into the region for work, about 270,000 commute out of the region to work. And we look at net commuters to show that while people may be coming into the region, in the case of this region, there are still more people going out of the region to work. And I just wanted to note quickly here that some of this data might look a little bit different than what you've seen at the state level from the state or from the recent EY report. And the main difference is that we're looking at net commuters here versus just inflow and outflow. Chris, anything you want to add there?
No, that's good.
All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about these challenges and some of the recommendations later in the presentation, because they tie directly into the key findings. But wanted to dive into some of our key findings from the sector analysis. So we'll go through each of the three sectors. Again, those are advanced manufacturing, aerospace, and cybersecurity. As you'll see, all three of these sectors have seen high job growth over the past 5 years and are projected to continue to grow. So it's very important to make sure the region has kind of that prepared workforce and a strong talent pipeline to be able to support that future growth. Just a little bit about our analysis. We leveraged a mix of traditional labor market information. So think, data coming from government sources like the census, BLS, things like that. And then combine that data with our rich job postings data to get a more of a real-time pulse on employer demand in each sector. So what we found in advanced manufacturing, the sector employs about 40,000 people in the region across nearly 1,800 different companies, and the average earnings per job are quite high. The chart here, you can see that kind of job growth over time and that projected job growth projected to over 41,000 by 2027. And then this slide highlights a couple of the key insights that we uncovered about the sector and its workforce needs. The region has an extremely high concentration of semiconductor and related device manufacturing, of boat building, of optical instrument and lens manufacturing, of circuit board manufacturing, and electronic connector manufacturing. So you can see within kind of advanced manufacturing, there are all these kind of niche areas that the region can focus on. And we found that all of the top 10 subsectors are projected to grow through 2027, with the exception of machine shops. That was the only one that was large in the region and not projected to grow as fast. When we look at staffing patterns for this sector, we can see that it requires a mix of occupations from high school level to bachelor's level, and even beyond that in some cases. And we find that wages vary quite a bit among those occupations. So while there are many high-paying jobs within the sector, if we look at the two largest occupations that make up this sector, they, by employment, though they pay less than $15 an hour. So kind of to that end, it'll be important to show strong career pathways and upward mobility opportunities within the sector. And we have some recommendations around that as well. We also see that advanced manufacturing has a higher risk of impending retirements than the other two sectors, which will be a challenge that the industry faces if there is not a strong enough pipeline of workers to fill those roles. And then finally, this is something that we see across all three sectors, but a lower representation of women and people of color within these sectors, and especially among the higher paying jobs. And again, we'll talk through some strategies on diversifying these sectors later on in the presentation. The next sector here is aerospace. It's a bit of a smaller sector and in some ways a sort of a subset of manufacturing. It includes the manufacturing of aerospace products as well as aviation and airport operations. So it's a little bit more all-inclusive there. You can see here that there are over 13,000 aerospace jobs in the region. Currently, it's projected to grow to almost 15,000 by 2027, and wages in this sector are also very high, even higher than what we see in advanced manufacturing. When we look at the makeup of the aerospace sector in the region, about 70% of jobs are coming from just two subsectors, that is search, detection, navigation, guidance, aeronautical and nautical systems. That's one subsector, and then guided missile and space vehicle manufacturing. So really, most of those jobs are coming from those two subsectors. And like manufacturing, we see this sector requires sort of a range of occupations from high school level to bachelor's degree level, and in roles from manufacturing to engineering to business function. There's a lot of diversity in roles here. And many of these jobs pay a living wage and are really great opportunities for regional workers. Looking at the demographics of this sector, we see sort of an interesting dynamic, which is that there is a high percentage of workers between the ages of 55 and 64, which shows that kind of future risk of impending retirements. But we also see a high percentage of workers between 25 and 34. So the sector is maybe doing a better job than the broader advanced manufacturing sector at recruiting, new entrants into the workforce, younger workforce. And then again, similar to advanced manufacturing, the aerospace sector in the region has a less diverse workforce than the regional workforce at large, with lower representation of women and people of color, again, especially among those high-paying jobs. All right, and then the third target sector here is cybersecurity. This sector employs over 17,000 people and has seen steady upward growth from 2011 to 2022 of nearly 7,000 jobs, and that growth is projected to continue. For our analysis, this sector was treated a little bit differently. So for advanced manufacturing and aerospace, we use industry classification codes or NEX codes to define the sectors. Cybersecurity, we looked at a little bit differently because we know that cybersecurity those roles can cross many different sectors. So instead we used occupation codes or SOC codes to define this sector and better capture the workforce and the skills needed specific to cybersecurity. So that's why if you see in here and in the full report, the data will look a little bit different. Some of the key insights that we found about cybersecurity Software developers currently account for the most jobs in the sector, but human resource specialists and computer and information systems managers are also large and increasing occupations in the region. All of the occupations that we included in our definition of cybersecurity sector require a bachelor's degree, typically require a bachelor's degree, I should say, with the exception of computer user support specialists. So while some of these roles by definition are available to only those who have completed a 4-year technical program, others might be attainable through non-traditional means. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of skills-based pathways later in the presentation and kind of reframing occupations that may not necessarily always require a bachelor's degree when you think about, how you're posting your jobs. Demographically, this sector skews younger, which indicates a lower risk of future retirements. And we saw at the high school level a variety of information technology related CTE programs that exist with high enrollments, which shows that there's a lot of interest from students in these types of career paths, which is great. And then again, like advanced manufacturing and aerospace, we see a lower representation of women and people of color, especially among the high-paying jobs in the sector. So all of our recommendations here kind of build off of that shared understanding of the key findings from our study and kind of start looking forward towards what the stakeholders around the table here can be working on together to move the needle in the region. So I'll kind of walk through our regional recommendations here. Chris, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after this. So the first recommendation we have here is to engage and attract women and people of color, especially into the target sectors. I think there's a broad opportunity at the regional level to do this, but specifically within the target sectors. And engaging these populations can open a wider and more diverse talent pool for employers. We have an example here as kind of a starting point to identify low-wage occupations that have a relatively high representation of women and people of color, and also have high skill similarity or skill adjacency to key sector occupations, and sort of use that to identify individuals in what we call feeder occupations that can fill those sector roles with minimal upskilling or reskilling required. So again, this example shows the type of transition that we're talking about from maids and housekeeping cleaners to painters within construction and maintenance, and kind of the opportunity to earn more wages and move to a occupation where they may be underrepresented. This is another program that we wanted to highlight as sort of a best practice or a case study to look at around increasing diversity. This is a research effort backed by the Command Shift Coalition that identifies a previously overlooked viable talent pipeline of women of color for careers in tech. And the report kind of focuses on approaches to sourcing, recruiting, and upskilling women of color with many of the skills that overlap with tech job requirements. So again, identifying those kind of feeder roles into key tech roles. Next recommendation here is kind of related to that challenge we talked about of the net outflow of commuters in the region. Workers leaving the region may indicate several different issues. It might be lack of job opportunities in the region in certain sectors or occupations. It might be higher paying jobs outside of the region, or just more of a general lack of awareness of opportunities that exist in the region. So the stakeholders around this table can really work regionally with economic development, workforce development, employers, to figure out what those reasons are and the skill sets of the workers commuting out of the region to sort of then develop a plan to address those issues and retain more workers in the region. This one is a key one that obviously all the organizations around the table here are working on already, but just strengthening the connections between local employers in the target sectors and the job seekers themselves. So using sessions like this and other kind of formats to confirm the research findings from this report, kind of use that as a baseline understanding, but then discuss those further with local employers to really build out kind of the more qualitative data around the workforce needs. This might be through different forums like this, one-on-one interviews with workforce development and employers, things like that, but gaining input from employers on a regular basis to kind of confirm these findings and keep them fresh will be really important. This one kind of goes back to the strategy I alluded to before about looking at kind of educational requirements for key occupations. And this one's especially important for that cybersecurity sector, since a majority of these roles tend to require a bachelor's degree or more, or historically have required a bachelor's degree or more. And we know that there might be opportunities to kind of re-examine those educational barriers and look more at some combination of, skills, transferable skills, targeted skill development, certifications, different credentials to kind of identify someone's, skill set in place of a bachelor's degree. The example that we have here is a tool developed by CompTIA and Lightcast that helps employers optimize their tech job postings. So you can kind of input a role, an industry experience level, and then it'll spit out recommendations around optimizing those job postings in terms of educational requirements and skills.
Ashley, can I add to this?
Yeah.
For those of you that are on the call that either work in this sector as a business and or work in workforce development, this tool adds a lot of value. One, this is a free tool from CompTIA that we partnered with on the build of this last year. And what we were discussing and what we were trying to understand is to this day, a lot of the hiring managers or those that still are coming from HR are still outputting standardized job postings from their HR system, their HRIS system. And so they'll put in their software engineer and it gives them a standardized posting. You can then now take that posting, you can put it into this system. It will then extract what skills are being said that needed in that standard job posting. And then we will connect that to labor market demand in your region to understand, are those the skills that we really need for a software engineer in that local region, as well as CompTIA also is adding some additional recommendations. So you have both the quantitative data that's coming from Lightcast job posting demand, as well as CompTIA's understanding of the industry and saying, well, you're asking for a bachelor's degree. Again, going back to this sector is very heavy on needing a bachelor's degree or higher. CompTIA will go in and say, you actually don't necessarily need a bachelor's degree. You may only need these 4 certifications. And that's not just CompTIA certifications. They brought in high yield IT certifications from even competitors because they wanted the tool to be utilized and accurate. So highly encourage individuals to use this tool if you're in that space.
Thanks, Chris. All right, the next recommendation is around attracting talent to the region. So I like to think of the workforce or the talent pool as sort of a bucket, and in most regions, the bucket is kind of leaky. So first and foremost, we want to make sure we stop the leaky bucket before trying to add more water to it, right? So talent retention and development is crucial, but in order to increase the pool of workers available, the region will also need to attract talent from outside of the region. So this data here is from our 2022 Talent Attraction Scorecard, which looks at several data points to determine which states and regions are doing the best job at attracting talent. Florida is in the #1 spot. So congratulations to you all around the table. And you can see I pulled out the county rankings for the 6 counties in the region as well. Most of them, within the top 20 to 40 to 100 to 150 is 140 was the highest, and that's out of 609 large counties. So that's still great. So the state and the region is already doing a great job of attracting talent. So, how can we continue to make sure this region is competitive and being a place that talent wants to locate, wants to live? This definitely requires sort of an all hands on deck approach. So workforce development, economic development, employers should all be collaborating to develop sort of a regional talent attraction strategy. We've got 2 examples here of a talent attraction campaign out of Buffalo, New York. You can see it's sort of a beautiful campaign. Would highly recommend you check that out. And while it's a beautiful campaign, they've done a lot of work behind the scenes to really identify their target audiences and their messaging about why Buffalo is a great place to live, work, and play, and really put data behind that phrase. And then the second example here is from Baton Rouge, BR Works campaign, and this really aims to connect people to jobs in the region. So recommend you check that out as well. This recommendation is around kind of looking at existing training programs focused on the occupations and skills that are most demanded in the region, especially within the target sectors, making sure your existing training programs are in alignment with the needs of employers. So this study has a lot of great data on skills that can be leveraged in conversations with educational institutions, with employers. The table here kind of shows the occupations and skills that overlap between at least 2 of the 3 target sectors. So really making sure that programs that meet the needs of these and teach these skills will benefit multiple employers. I've highlighted kind of software developers there as one need that we saw very consistently across the 3 different sectors. And again, one that typically requires a bachelor's degree. So there may be opportunities to kind of rethink that one. This one will look kind of similar to the first recommendation, but it's basically by looking at career opportunities and skill-based pathways. So especially within advanced manufacturing, because there are a number of occupations that are critical to that sector, but pay below a living wage. We know that those occupations might not be ideal long-term career opportunities for workers, but they can serve as sort of an entry point into the sector, and then workers can move up from there. So building skill-based career pathways within this sector will kind of show workers the potential career trajectories and support upward mobility across the sector. So this example here is looking at kind of career pathways and skill adjacency for a key role in the advanced manufacturing sector, which is inspectors, testers, sorters, samplers, and weighers. So it's an important occupation for the advanced manufacturing sector. Wages are about $19 an hour, which is relatively low compared to other advanced manufacturing roles. So the graphic on the left is showing feeder occupations into that role based on skill similarity and a wage increase. So by looking at this kind of data, you can kind of identify workers both within manufacturing already, as well as workers outside of manufacturing that might have skill overlap with that key role, and build a talent pipeline of workers that are in those kind of feeder occupations. And then on the right, that graphic is showing the next step occupation. So from that inspector's occupation to next step occupation, again, based on skill similarity and a wage increase, you can see that there are several management positions and engineering technician positions that have really high skill similarity. It could be a next step career move for a worker, and showing them that pathway will be important. This is just sort of another way to look at those type of career pathways and transitions. So this is an analysis that we did for the life sciences sector in another region. The occupations in purple in the middle there are those that are in demand, but again, tend to be lower wage. We think of those as sort of transitional occupations or stepping stones. So you can see the occupations that feed into those that have high skill similarity, and then the next step occupations as well. And then on the bottom there is sort of one of those transitions pulled out, and you can see the skills overlap and the skills gap between 2 occupations. So you can imagine that, this sort of mapping would produce a whole lot of skills data. And then in a way, we can sort of organize that and think about what are those critical skills that can help people move from one occupation to the next. Specific to the advanced manufacturing sector, we identified a need to expand advanced manufacturing related CTE programs. So while we saw that there are several CTE programs relevant to this space, a majority of them are more engineering related, would lead to something like a bachelor's degree, and they have smaller enrollments relative to other programs like culinary, like marketing, like some of the IT programs. And the region would really benefit from expanding existing programs and increasing awareness of opportunities within advanced manufacturing that may not require a bachelor's degree, but lead to long-term, family sustaining careers such as welding, engineering technician positions. There's a lot of great career opportunities within advanced manufacturing that don't necessarily require a bachelor's degree. And promoting advanced manufacturing opportunities to K-12 students will also kind of help combat the risk of impending retirements within this sector. Specific to aerospace, we saw a need here to increase aerospace specific programming, and we kind of listed out here. There's a lot of great things going on in the region already related to, CTE and higher education. Specific to the aerospace sector, thinking about what's offered at Embry-Riddle, what's offered at Eastern Florida State. We saw that the Eastern Florida State Aerospace Program currently fairly small with only 25 graduates in 2021, and we know that they're expanding that program, but we think there's just an opportunity to further engage K-12 and local community colleges to build out the capacity for more really aerospace specific programming and expanding the existing programs, specifically again for those occupations that don't require a bachelor's degree, because there's a lot of great jobs in this space as well. Specific to cybersecurity, this recommendation is around looking at existing programs in IT at the CTE, the community college, and higher education level. Review them and make sure that they have sort of a focus or a pathway specific to cybersecurity. And where it's not a focus, how can we incorporate it into existing programs or build out new programs to make sure that they're just a strong talent pipeline for the specific area within the broader IT space. The example that we show here is a tool that can be used by employers, educators, and job seekers that really helps understand the career pathways within cybersecurity and the skills and certifications most important to those pathways. So we put a link here to the CyberSeek website, and it's sort of an interesting kind of infographical way to see the opportunities in the sector. And then this was one that showed up as a need within cybersecurity and aerospace. Was you can see about 60 to 70% of alumni from relevant programs are still in the state, but about 34 to 40% are leaving the state or the country after graduation, or some of these people may be virtual learners as well. And even with those staying in the state, they may not be staying in the region. So we wanted to think about, how can we make sure that we connect and tie these alumni to the region, the community, the job opportunities, and help them stay in the region versus leave after education. Apprenticeships are a great way to do this. There's ways to think about, in the case of virtual learners, getting them to come to the campus to see the community, to see the region, virtual job fairs, kind of any different ways to connect them back to the opportunities in the region and the community. And then another way you can kind of look at this is to conduct a migration analysis on those who have left the region already to kind of understand who those people are, where they're going, what skills they're taking with them to other locations, so that you can develop additional strategies to retain alumni based on that data. So the example that we have here is from work that we did in Richmond, Virginia, to analyze alumni from their higher ed programs. And we did this using online professional profiles data. And through this type of analysis, we can really see where alumni are going, which education programs have the highest attrition rates, and what occupations those alumni are in, which may point to students, not being able to get a job in the region in a given field, but it'll help us kind of look at those different data points with the main goal of figuring out ways to better retain alumni in the region and also attract those people back. All right, I've done enough talking, so I'm going to hand it back over to Chris a little bit to talk about next steps and implementation.
Thanks, Ashley. Just a couple of things. We won't spend a lot of time on this because we wanted to spend some time answering some questions, but we know that this can't stop with just the data. And so we really encourage those that are on the call to really be a part of the committees and the councils that are going to be discussed. And the reason for that is because, you know, Lightcast's expertise for the most part is a lot of quantifiable data. And so we need that qualifiable data that we get from employers to be, as Ashley said earlier, to be able to see, is this data what you're seeing in the local region as well? Another recommendation, and all regions have already moved forward in their own version of this, but looking at systems to be able to better match individuals based on skills to jobs. We are working with one of the regions on one of those areas, and as well as the other two are working with other products as well to be able to implement new ways of thinking around how do we look at that hiring process. And so there's a variety of ways that way. Another thing that's not on here is that looking at things like Cybersecurity, which we showed earlier on those career pathways and things of that nature. There's a variety of tools out in the marketplace that can do some of that work and really encourage individuals to reconsider how they would look at those pathways. What are the wages, the growth, things of that nature. And so we highly encourage that. An example would be that BR Works, the Baton Rouge campaign, have implemented some of these strategies as well. And they are seeing some success from those strategies that they're implementing around that campaign. So our recommendation is, what would a campaign look like that on the East Coast of Florida, specifically focused in these sectors? Ashley, next slide, I think, or we go to Q&A.
Yeah, we're good to go to Q&A.
Awesome. So we want to take a few minutes based maybe on what you saw today, the data. We're happy to answer a few questions. We have a few minutes to be able to do that. So if you could write your questions, I think in the chat box, if it's turned on. Right now it says chat is turned off for the meeting. So if they can't write it in there, then just unmute yourself and hopefully we don't have 10 people do that at once.
Are you tracking individuals with disabilities, whether they're employed or not?
Ashley, you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, you can start and then I can jump in.
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier that we conducted a study in partnership with the Able Trust Foundation, which they're a state organization that works with really the vocational rehabilitation organizations throughout the state. So from a state perspective, we conducted a lot of research on who's working, who's not working, and we broke that down by the specific disabilities. I think there's still a lot of knowledge to be had around visible versus invisible. How does that apply into employers, and what are employers' thoughts on working with individuals with disabilities? But we did not dive into that in this specific study within the region.
I just want to highlight that I do have a training program that I oversee that trains individuals with disabilities for entry-level IT jobs.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Jessica had a question. How do employers get access to the CompTIA website? I'll send that link to the organizers. And so as a follow-up, we'll make sure that you get that link. I don't have it right on hand, or I just posted it in the chat. So I'll make sure you get that link, as well as we'll make the slides available to the participants as well. Ken asked, what are the underlying factors in labor force participation declines? Ashley, do you want me to take that as well?
Yeah, you could talk for an hour about that, couldn't you, Chris?
We have done extensive research around labor force participation, and there's a variety of indicators that we're seeing. And as Ashley said, we do presentations. I do them weekly around demographic drought and labor force participation. So some of the things that we're seeing lately, we've been talking a little bit around immigration. So we've seen, this is at a national perspective, we see 1 million less immigrants, legal immigrants coming to the United States than we were expected to have at this year. Some of that had to do with the pandemic, and we saw a lot of individuals that historically would study internationally come over here to study in post-secondary. That decline was about 65% during the pandemic, and a lot of those individuals would stay for work afterwards or find jobs afterwards. So we saw that decline. Now, we did see an uptick, and we've closed that gap from a loss of 2 million immigrants to 1 million over the last year and a half. We are seeing a huge increase over the last year and undocumented workers. And so our research has kind of focused on that a little bit. There are a bunch of other indicators that we also discuss. One, we talk about the birth replacement rate. So we're just not making the people to replace those that we're losing. And so that's one indicator. And then another indicator we talk often about is we know that there's a huge effects of drug and opioid crisis in America, and Florida is not as part of that, where we see millions of individuals not in the workforce today because of what we're seeing from that factor. There are some other areas that we focus on. We start to break down what we call missing worker and those missing worker categories. And so when you start to think about the effects of like childcare, or we also are looking at parents, while they can get childcare, they're becoming more dependent on having to take care of elderly. And so that's another factor that we're also looking at. So I don't want to, I could talk about, like Ashley said, I could talk about labor force participation all day. So we won't dive into it too long, but that is one of some of the things that we are looking at, and certainly is an important factor as we're looking at how to build a workforce in our state. There's quite a few questions coming in, so hold on one second. Do you have for our area the key factors to bring employers to our places of employment for each sector? Do you have for our area the key factors to bring employers to our places?
It was employees.
Oh, employee. Sorry. Okay. Ashley, did we in this study look at skills in other regions from a recruiting standpoint?
We looked at sort of pockets of areas within the Southeast United States that have a high concentration of these workers. So those can be like kind of an initial look at regions where you could attract talent from, but it wasn't a full analysis by any means.
Ashley, there's a question related to the alumni retention. Did we look at all public universities around the state of Florida and as well as private institutions, or were they only the institutions within the region?
Yeah, it was only the institutions within the region. And I think that kind of goes to another question as well, like around why are people moving out of the state? So we didn't go into a full sort of alumni analysis as part of this scope, but certainly a lot of the questions in the chat are raising great discussion points of like, how do we take this to the next step?
Yeah. Next question. What percentage of students enrolling in the CTE programs are successfully entering careers in cybersecurity? And/or I would argue any of the other sectors. Ash, I'll let you start, and then I may have something to add to that as well.
Yeah. We didn't do kind of the connection piece to say, here's the people that are going through the CTE programs. We have the data around how many people went through the CTE programs, but I think the missing link right now is then where did those students go after? Did they go to a 4-year? Did they go right into the workforce? Did they get a job in cybersecurity or in one of the target sectors or beyond that? And we could certainly look at that using our profiles database, but it wasn't necessarily the scope of this work.
Yeah, this is also a very, very challenging study to conduct. I think following a student out of high school. So understanding what the student, what classes they took, what certifications they earned if they were in that CTE program, and then following them once they graduate, whether they go right into the workforce or go into some sort of post-secondary educational program. This has been a topic that has come up in many regions across the country is, are we producing a workforce through our CTE programs in the K-12 system? And the answer is we're just not sure, because a lot of students that go into those CTE programs are in those CTE programs not necessarily because they're thinking about a career in that area. They're in those programs because it's a fun pathway in high school. You get to do cool stuff. And while it's a cool kind of career explorational experience, a lot of them are in those programs because it gives them something to do in high school that is just a little bit different. Now they are learning key skills, and those skills can help them along the way in their careers. But in terms of them transitioning directly into the workforce, that is something that we haven't been able to do a full study on to understand, just from the fact of trying to follow those students. So I think there's more work and analysis that has to be done in general, not just in this region, but across the country, on how CT is playing out when it comes to those going into post-secondary or into the workforce. How do you help our educators understand about paying our teachers to bring the proper talent to our classrooms? To me, this is a huge problem in the area, since our CTE teachers need to be paid at a higher rate, since this is what industries are paying. Teacher pay in general is it's always a touchy subject, and it's a challenge across the country. So it's not just regionally specific. And I do recognize that when you're trying to get industry leaders in the classroom, that there's a premium to that. And I know that there are some regions and other states that pay some of those premium wages, but historically, it's one of those things, like individuals that get into teaching, they kind of know they're getting into it knowing it's going to be lesser than they probably would make in the marketplace. And I'm not arguing that teachers are getting paid a fair wage or anything among that wage. I'm just saying that is something that we see, and it's a challenge, and I don't necessarily have an answer to it. It is a policy, probably a policy issue that would have to be dived into in a deeper way. Why are people moving out of the state? Our data shows high graduation, and us being #1 in talent attraction. So why are our wages not growing compared with other states? Ashley, I'll let you start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is certainly worth a deeper analysis in terms of thinking about who your alumni are that are leaving the state. Is it, certain occupations of people? Is it certain, skill sets or programs that are leaving the state, and really kind of drilling into those and understanding, is it a wage thing? Is it that there's not enough job opportunity for whatever specific occupation they're going into, or just a lack of awareness, kind of like the commuter data as well? So I don't know, Chris, anything you would add there?
Yeah, this scope didn't go into a deep dive analysis where, we have the ability to look at the specific occupations and skills that are essentially leaving the region, and find out where they're going. I would say one of the things that, and this is across the country, so it might not necessarily be specific to the region, is that COVID played a huge role. The pandemic played a huge role on individuals being able to choose where they want to live and work if they can be remote. And there's a variety of other indicators that are pros and cons to that. But if I was in the region, I was working as a software engineer, and I know Florida, as we mentioned, has stayed on pace with cost of living among many of the comparable states. But if I have high-speed internet and I can move to a rural area in South Carolina, just as an example, I'm not saying they moved to South Carolina, that could be one of the factors, because cost of living is lower and I got to maintain those higher wages. And so that's a conversation we're having with many regions across the country, especially for those that see a lot of outbound migration. Florida benefits in general to a lot of inbound migration, but there are a lot of states that we work with and a lot of regions that don't see that, and they're expected to have projected growth in the negatives over the course of the next 5 years. Again, another positive to Florida not really experiencing negative population growth. And so there's a variety of ways we could look at this data. We didn't do that deep dive analysis, but that's some of the anecdotes that we're hearing in the market. We only have a couple more minutes, so I'll take a couple more questions. Was the data gathered focused on the adult market, or was the secondary market included or considered? Adult market.
Veronica said a couple minutes later that we answered her question. So
okay,
Veronica, feel free to jump in if you have another question about that.
Vincent, you mentioned apprenticeships. Will there be a group sponsored? Who would be the sponsor apprenticeship program in the occupations mentioned today? That is out of our scope of work. So you'll have to talk to the smart people from the career sources to get that question answered. Okay, last question. Are there models to reference where industry and education have partnered to attract and prepare seasoned industry workers to teach in the post-secondary educational setting? I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't have any either, but we'll think on it and
Yeah, if we come up with stuff, we can definitely write you. Listen, thank you so much from Ashley and I in the Lightcast team. We really appreciate the opportunity and your focus today and all the questions. We really enjoyed diving into this work. If you think of a question or have a follow-up, feel free to email us. As I mentioned, we will make sure that these slides are available to the organizers to get out to you, as well as I'll make sure you get the link to the CompTIA websites or any other prominent websites that we might have mentioned today that might